Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Stanley, and today we are in our second episode of analyzing Viktor E. Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Last episode, we did a survey of part 1, which detailed his experiences in the concentration camp and some of the things he learned about the soul, about suffering, about human beings, and about finding meaning and purpose in an otherwise hopeless situation. And this week, we are going to analyze his conclusions and his school of psychology that he developed as he survived the concentration camp and went on to live a very successful career. And a lot of his ideas started even before the war and all those sorts of things, but they only ever made it to print after he survived, and it's really lucky that happened, or providential, or however you'd like to think about it, because his ideas were really strengthened in the concentration camp, and I think it's very clear that part 1 and part 2 of Man's Search for Meaning could not survive unless they were together, unless there really was a part 1 and part 2. And one of the things Viktor Frankl concluded from his time in the concentration camp is that the fundamental human motivation is not actually pleasure, as Freud thought, nor is it status, as it was for Adler, but it's actually meaning. And the reason he concluded that was because he discovered firsthand that Friedrich Nietzsche's maxim that he who has a why can bear almost any how was presented to him in a really clear and vivid way. He saw people who were willing to die and suffer for what they believed, and that's just not compatible with a theory that says that pleasure is the sole motivation of a human being. So what we're going to do on this episode is talk about mental health and good therapy, according to Frankl. And on his view, mental health and good therapy consists of challenging people and helping them discover a proper why, a proper meaning, and by that, they can survive anyhow. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what's on the docket. And I think you'll really benefit from our discussion. But before we move on, I would like to ask that you like our Facebook page, that you follow us on Twitter, and you subscribe to YouTube. Please leave a review on iTunes, Facebook, and wherever else you get your podcasts. That is really helpful for us. And if you've benefited from Well-Read Christian, or you believe in our mission, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support our work on our website, wellreadchristian.com. There you will also find detailed quotes from authors that we talk about, sources on music and art pieces that we use, articles written by myself and others, and more information about our goals and beliefs available free of charge. These are tough times for all of us, and if your contribution would cause any amount of financial pressure, please do not even consider it. But for those who are willing and able to give, it is because of your gift that the podcast can continue and grow. So thank you. One of my favorite episodes yet so far, although I feel like I say that every time, and every now and then I look at our catalog and go, man, I'm actually really proud of some of these episodes. But in any case, part 2 of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is an introduction to Frankl's view of psychology. And a lot of people think that psychology is this branch of knowledge, and they're right. I mean, that is what psychology is. It's a field of study. It's a discipline. But it's not like biology or mathematics. It's far closer to philosophy. There are at least 8 different schools of psychology that I can think of, all of them extremely different and many mutually exclusive. A comprehensive list of the schools of psychology is closer to 50, with 6 of them being labeled the most influential and important, but still mutually exclusive and contradictory. So when you think of psychology, I want you to understand that the field is as diverse as philosophy, and there's actually quite a bit of overlap between philosophy and psychology. And that's because what psychology is, fundamentally, is a worldview which encompasses a human being. Obviously, there's empirical evidence and studies and things and research that goes into it, but every school of psychology has a worldview, and every school of psychology answers these fundamental questions. Number 1, what is a human being? Number 2, what is wrong with him? And number 3, how can we fix him? So there you have it. You have an anthropology, a hamartiology, and a soteriology, a doctrine of man, a doctrine of sin, and a doctrine of salvation. So with the question of what is a human being, what psychology asks are, or what psychologists ask are, what does it mean to be human? Is man controlled fundamentally by his environment? Is he basically just a complex nervous system? Can he fundamentally change himself? And those kinds of questions. That's an anthropology. And with the hamartiology, the question is, what is wrong with man? Is it that his environment corrupts him? Is it that he has been manipulated by society? Is it that he has chemical imbalances in the brain? Is it that experiences from childhood have corrupted him and damaged him, perhaps even beyond repair? And that's just the case of all of us, and that's what we all are, just hobbling victims of our childhood. And then, of course, all psychologies have a soteriology. They have a doctrine of salvation. How can we help people? What is the way in which man moves from being sick to healthy? And if the problem is behavior, can you train him like you would an animal? That's sort of behaviorism's answer. Do you right the chemical imbalances? Do you medicate him? Do you talk about his problems and help him overcome the inevitable trauma of his childhood? So those are soteriological questions. And so you see how psychology, philosophy, and religion all kind of share a common ground in this regard. Well, why am I telling you any of this? Well, the reason is because in part 2 of Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl introduces his school of psychology. He calls it logotherapy, loga, meaning from the Greek word logos, which means meaning or word or logic. And as I said earlier, Frankl believed, contrary to Freud, that the primary drive that people have is actually for meaning. So what Frankl does is he argues that people in the 20th century lost their sense of meaning. And they lost it when they lost their traditions. So his anthropology is essentially a Judeo-Christian one. Man is a body and a soul. He is capable of making free choices and determining his own outcome. He's ultimately responsible for his decisions, and his decisions will eventually shape who he is. And then that's what's wrong with him. What's wrong with him is that he doesn't know what choices to make. He is fundamentally lost without his traditions. And following the death of God, he has no guiding principles. He is surrounded by pain and guilt and death, and these things are inevitable in life. And the solution, therefore, is to accept the challenge that life presents, to overcome the catastrophes of life with character and finding meaning in the courageous endurance of suffering. So very, very similar to Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson actually is a huge fan of Viktor Frankl and recommends a lot of his works and that kind of a thing. Now, Frankl, who was a religious Jew himself, believed in the semi-secularization of his work, meaning that he believed he could separate the salvation of the soul from the healing of the soul. And I am not so optimistic. As a Christian, I believe that spiritual truths, if they are true, will bring salvation and healing to the soul. So as we go through Frankl's psychology, which I think is absolutely spot on, by the way, I hope you don't mind if I comment on some of Frankl's ideas every now and then about not only what can heal a man, but also what can save him. And the reason that I think it's going to be important is because my view is that you can't actually separate those things. They are one and the same. What heals him is what saves him, and what saves him is what heals him. So the first thing we're going to do in this episode is take an in-depth survey of how Viktor Frankl answers those three categories that Frankl offers: his view of man, his view of what is wrong with man, and his view of how to rescue man from himself. And I guarantee that whether you agree with Frankl or with me at all, you will find extremely valuable the insights and the incredible life advice that Viktor Frankl has to offer. So to start, let's talk about Frankl's view of man, as well as his predicament. Now, if you've been a longtime listener of the podcast, or otherwise have listened to the episodes on Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, or perhaps our Dostoevsky episodes, you'll be very familiar with how Viktor Frankl chooses to open part 2 of his book, Man's Search for Meaning. What he does is he states the case for why man is lost. He has lost his way. 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, basically all of time except for the 20th and 21st century, man had a pretty good idea about where he came from, about where he is going, and about what he's doing. Tradition oriented our lives in a way that gave us answers to the deepest and most profound questions. Now, you could point out that those answers can be criticized, and you might also point out that different cultures had different answers, and you would be right. But Christianity, in Europe, since the time of Christ, found answers to these questions that grounded the human psyche past barbarism and tribalism and paganism. And the imperialism of Europe brought that psyche throughout the world. But now that the world is globalized and we can all see each other, we are less confident that our answers are true. We have become lost. Truth has become a dizzying prospect. We have lost our balance and become nauseated at the religious jabber. As a culture, we no longer believe in our Christian heritage. So Frankl says this, quote, "No instinct tells man what he has to do. No tradition tells him what he ought to do. Sometimes he does not even know what he wishes to do. Therefore, he wishes to do what others do, conformism, or what others wish him to do, totalitarianism," end quote. So what Frankl says is that because of the nihilism that has creeped into the soul of man following the death of God, man is prone to conformism and totalitarianism. He has lost his way and he needs to remember who he is. And Frankl is careful not to push his own Judeo-Christian view of man, but he's not afraid to say that scientific naturalism, the view of the Nazis, is false. Listen to this fantastic quote. I've used it before, but it is so powerful that you need to hear it perhaps again. Quote, "If we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him. When we present him as an automation of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment, we feed the nihilism to which modern man is, in any case, prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers," end quote. What Frankl is saying is this: we know that human beings are not just matter and motion. We are not just environment plus genes. We are not just complex animals or moist robots. And we also know what happens when an entire society comes to believe that. He says elsewhere that if you believe man is merely meat and bones and his value comes from his utility to society, then you owe your objection to eugenics and mercy killings of the old and the handicapped to personal inconsistency. For more on this, go back and listen to our series on Nietzsche. Frankl's view of man is a very existentialist one. Man is thrown into existence without knowing how or why, because he does not have tradition to guide him anymore, the result of what he calls an existential vacuum. The existential vacuum is the seeds of nihilism, or the pole of meaninglessness. Frankl quotes Schopenhauer saying that man is doomed to vacillate between the two extremes of crippling boredom and excruciating anxiety. The existential vacuum manifests itself, according to Frankl, in boredom, depression, aggression, and addiction, and these are the things which are gripping our society today. We see this with social media, video games, marijuana, or whatever else, as they are used to fill the void within us, to fill that existential vacuum. The escapism of our culture is evidence of this vacuum that Frankl is talking about. Frankl says that the man who gives up in camp and lets himself die is the same man who decides to shoot up heroin. The future doesn't exist. There is only the now. There's only this present pain that I am feeling, and that is it. For those who can't escape through electronics or drugs, a spiritual depression sets in, a feeling that everything is meaningless, that life doesn't matter, that the future is only bleak and miserable, and it would be better if it just ended right now. There's a reason that most suicides happen on the weekend. People just got through their work week. They've been looking forward to the weekend, but now the weekend is here, passing and over, and it didn't deliver the promised escape and happiness. So now it's Sunday, and you're looking at another terrible week in front of you, and you look ahead of that one and see that there's another week after that and another week after that, and it's never going to end. And so this depression sets in because people realize that everything they're doing is meaningless, and they become aware of this existential vacuum in their own hearts. Viktor Frankl cites an interesting study finding that 90% of alcoholics suffer from, quote, an abysmal feeling of meaninglessness, end quote. 100% of drug addicts studied by Stanley Krippner believed that, quote, things seemed meaningless, end quote. Frankl also cites an interesting study on aggression between groups, by the way, and the study showed that the only way to dissolve escalating aggression between two groups was if they worked together towards a common goal, according to the findings of Simon and Schuster. In there is a key to healing our political tension, by the way, finding common goals and actually pursuing them together. Another way Frankl detects the existential vacuum, the feeling of general meaninglessness, is in unemployed and in retired men. You know, nobody talks about how the suicide rates for older men or retired men are sky high. Same with unemployed people. What Frankl found when working in suicide wards among these groups was that encouraging them to volunteer their time doing something that they thought was meaningful cured depression and suicide at an unbelievable rate. If you don't have something meaningful to do with your hands, if you don't have a job, you will easily slump into depression because you feel useless and therefore meaningless. People often justify their existence with their work. They say, yeah, I know, I'm pathetic and stupid and full of ugly vices, but at least I can move this from here to there. At least I can bring in a humble sum to pay for the expenses of my wretched existence. When you take that away from either a retired person or an unemployed person, they suddenly come face to face with their aimlessness. And it can push people to places that they just don't come back from. But what Frankl found is that when unemployed and retired people who suffered from depression find something valuable to spend their time doing, even volunteering at animal shelters or public libraries, when they found something significant and important to do with their time, then the depression would go away. Work can do wonders for giving us a sense of meaning or significance. Thus, Frankl offers a beautiful line, quote, "Man does not live by welfare alone," end quote. Frankl's conclusion through all this analysis of the existential vacuum is that mental health is not achieved in a state of peace or equilibrium. Instead, mental health is found in striving towards a worthy goal and giving it everything you have. As paradoxical as it might seem, it's a heavy load that makes a bridge stronger, not rest. And the same goes for people. The cure for the existential vacuum, the cure for spiritual depression or suicidal thoughts, addiction, and aggression, is to find something meaningful. Find something that makes all the pain and misery worth it. And then when you find it, commit yourself to it. Frankl says that the human being is not a closed system. We are inherently directed at something or someone else. You cannot find the meaning of life by looking at yourself or inventing it yourself. You have to go into the world to find it. The more you look inward, the more guaranteed you are to miss it. But if you look and find something worth doing, if you find a why to your existence, you can bear any how. In episode 2, we talked about Leo Tolstoy's character Pierre Bezukhov and his journey to find the meaning of life. Eventually, he found it in God, and I argued that only the unique and dynamic interaction between your soul and the person of Jesus can ever be fully satisfying, kind of an Augustinian notion. And Frankl's view is compatible with this, but it's less abstract, more concrete. Let me fully flesh out Viktor Frankl's view, which is essentially secular, and then I'll talk about how I integrate Frankl, Tolstoy, and an Augustinian view of meaning at the end of the podcast. So for Frankl, what is the meaning of life? What is it? In plain English, Well, it differs from man to man and from minute to minute. It's not an abstraction. It's an acute awareness of what your freedom allows you to actualize against the background of reality. It's taking every minute of every day and recognizing how good and profound of a job you could do with this opportunity or task that life has given you, and how much misery and wretchedness you could produce with this moment if you failed to do the right thing. Finding meaning in life is realizing that it is not you who ask, but life which asks you. And it is up to you to respond to life's inquiry. And you don't respond with thought or notion, but with action. As you are living your life, you can look at yourself and say, what am I living for? What am I doing? And that is the answer that you are giving to the meaning of life. And you can change that answer with your behavior. Let me give you a quote. Quote, as each situation in life represents a challenge to man and presents a problem for him to solve, the question of the meaning of life may actually be reversed. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to his life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. Thus, logotherapy sees in responsibleness the very essence of human existence. This emphasis on responsibleness is reflected in the categorical imperative of logotherapy, which is, live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. It seems to me that there is nothing which would stimulate a man's sense of responsibleness more than this maxim, which invites him to imagine first that the present is the past, and second, that the past may yet be changed and amended. Such a precept confronts him with life's finiteness, as well as the finality of what he makes out of both his life and himself. End quote. Frankl says that asking what the meaning of life is like asking a chess master what the best move in chess is. It depends on the board. There are more variations of possible chess games than there are atoms in the universe. The goal of life is not to make a certain move on the board, but to become a certain kind of player who recognizes a good move from a bad one. For Viktor Frankl, who found himself in a concentration camp in 1939, he realized that the meaning of life could be enduring the suffering given to you and finding a few of the infinite reasons that you are valuable and keeping that as the central focus. For him, one of the reasons that he was individually valuable was because he was a son. He had parents. Those parents would never have another Viktor Frankl. There is only one. You are irreplaceable. That alone gives you incalculable worth. You could multiply this tenfold. Your relationship with your parents, your spouse, your colleagues, everything. If Frankl dies, that's it. He's gone forever. His unique perspective on psychology is gone forever. His unique capacity to carry the heritage of his family, gone forever. His ability to make the lives of those around him in the concentration camp slightly better amidst the horrors of Auschwitz is gone forever. He has the opportunity and the responsibility to do the right thing and to make the most of every opportunity. Because if he doesn't, he's just making everything worse for everyone else. Every time an opportunity came up to encourage a fellow or glare at him, to moan from your pain or to grin and bear it, to curse under your breath or to hold it in, every choice and every day is a chance to do the right thing or the wrong thing. And whatever you choose, it is sealed into the past forever. So you must live as if you have one chance to make the difference. Frankl recalls two stories of people who were going to kill themselves in the concentration camps. Each of them said that they had nothing left to expect from life, and they were talked off the ledge because Frankl said that life had more expected from them. One had a son who still lived in a foreign country, and another had a research project that only he could finish. And truly, only he could complete the work in his way. No one could replace him. just as only a true father can be the optimal lover of his child. This is true for all of us. Only we can do the work that is set out for us in exactly the way that we can approach it. Viktor Frankl continues, quote, "When the impossibility of replacing a person is realized, it allows the responsibility which a man has for his existence and its continuance to appear in all its magnitude. A man who has become conscious of the responsibility he bears towards a human being who affectionately waits for him or to an unfinished work will never be able to throw away his life. He who knows the why for his existence will bear almost anyhow." End quote. If you'll allow a brief intermission, I was thinking about the relationship between faith and works within Christianity. It can be kind of a tricky thing because we are saved by God's grace, but that grace is supposed to change our character in such a dramatic way so as to produce good works. Good works themselves do not earn us salvation, but if we are truly saved, we will see our character and our actions grow more and more in line with God's will and commandments. And it struck me that there's a paradox here which is solved by the question of character. It's not about what you do. It's not. You can never be a good enough person to merit God's favor. Sin is a part of our fabric. It's a part of our consciousness. You cannot surgically remove it. You cannot suppress it. You cannot avoid it. But believing in God's actions through Jesus and trusting his promises of pardon for our moral crimes and guilt, and the thankfulness and relief and love and harmony that we can have with God as a result of this, is supposed to produce a change of character. And that character change produces righteous behavior. You might think, why are we talking about any of this? Well, it struck me that I think the same thing is true with the meaning of life. I think there are parallels here. The meaning of life is not to have a certain thought or pray a certain prayer or see a certain way. The meaning of life is not to do a certain action or have a certain status, let's say. The meaning of life is to become a certain kind of person, namely, a person who loves and cherishes and admires God, on my view. And a person who loves and admires God is going to love and admire people who are made in his image. And he's going to love trees and children and justice and courage and art and food and sex and music and everything else that he has created. And he's going to express that love with proper action, proper attitudes, etc. And I'll talk more about my final conclusions about the meaning of life after faithfully representing Viktor Frankl. But that brief intermission, if you'll excuse it, I thought might have been important at this moment. This idea of seeing life as if you had lived it already and now you're living it a second time, but the first time you had messed it up as badly as you're about to mess it up right now, I have found to be extremely powerful. When I'm about to do something that I know is wrong, I realize that if I were to do this, it would become sealed forever in time as something that I've done. And instead, I have the opportunity to do the right thing here and now, and then forever erect a monument of success which can never be erased. I could just keep doing the same thing over and over again, making the same old mistakes, responding in the same old ways. Or I could live as if this was my second chance, and this time I don't have to mess it up. I can change the past. And Frankl takes this incredible maxim even farther. He says that you can do this with your suffering and turn your sufferings into triumphs. Every single day in the concentration camp was a finite day. It was a day that would come to an end. All those years, but then it's over. Now, every day, he could make a choice. Do I become a little bit more bitter, a little bit more angry, a little bit more resentful? Do I retreat into myself and let my spiritual self die? Or do I encourage others? Or do I just close my eyes? Do I run and touch that electric fence? Or do I work just one more day? And when you see your suffering as an opportunity for triumph and growth, then you come to realize that no matter what happens to you, no matter what your circumstances are, there is always a way to turn it into a good thing. And as every day passes, you can say, one more day down, one more day to go. After Frankl survived the Holocaust, he had lost everyone. His pregnant wife, his parents, most of his friends, family. But he did go on to become a psychiatrist. He remembers an old man who came into his office for an appointment, saying that his wife had died 2 years ago, and he was just racked with depression and loneliness. He just could not move on from this woman who he had spent decades of his life with. Viktor asked him, well, would you prefer that you had died instead of her? And he said, God, no, I would never want her to suffer the way that I'm suffering. And so he said, well, one of you has to die first. One of you would have had to suffer once the other dies. And aren't you glad that you can take that burden from her? The man said nothing, stood up, shook Frankl's hand, and walked out of his office without saying a word. That was all he needed. He needed to realize that his suffering meant something, that it was achieving some purpose, that it was not aimless or random. He could suffer for his wife, not because of her. And so, meaning would get him along. And I'm convinced that you could do this with everyday life, even with your spouse, still alive, when you're patient with them or kind to them, or whatever it is. In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of sacrifice. End quote. Another story. Frankl was working at the hospital, and a single mother was admitted to the emergency room for a suicide attempt. When Frankl talked to her, it was clear why she wanted to kill herself. Her life was full of pain. She was a single mother of 2 children. The eldest was confined to a wheelchair, and her youngest, at 11 years old, had died traumatically a few years ago. Now this mom wanted to enter a suicide pact with her eldest son, who she was taking care of, but he refused. He liked living, and he valued his life, despite the hardships of being completely crippled. So she tried to kill herself alone, and now here she was in the suicide ward with Viktor Frankl. And over the following weeks, Viktor invited her into logotherapy group sessions with other psychiatrists and such. And he remembers that he happened to visit one day and enter into one of their group discussions. He turned to another patient, a 30-year-old woman, and he asked her to imagine that she was on her deathbed as an 80-year-old. She had no children, but she enjoyed financial success and social prestige. Frankl asked what this lady would say to herself, what she would think about her life looking back. I'll pick up the story and quote. Quote, "Oh, I married a millionaire. I had an easy life full of wealth, and I lived it up. I flirted with men, I teased them. But now I am 80. I have no children of my own. Looking back as an old woman, I cannot see what all that was for. Actually, I must say, my life was a failure." I then invited the mother of this handicapped son to imagine herself similarly looking back over her life. Let us listen to what she had to say as recorded on the tape. "I wished to have children, and this wish has been granted to me. One boy died. The other, however, the crippled one, would have been sent to an institution if I had not taken over his care. Though he is crippled and helpless, he is, after all, my boy, and so I have made a fuller life possible for him. I have made a better human being out of my son." At this moment, there was an outburst of tears and crying. She continued, "As for myself, I can look back peacefully on my life, for I can say my life was full of meaning, and I have tried hard to fulfill it. I have done my best. I have done the best for my son. My life was no failure." End quote. By considering her life from her deathbed, by thinking as if she had a second chance to do the right thing after messing it up horribly the first time, she recognized that a life of sacrifice and suffering on behalf of her son was actually a life worth living. On her deathbed, she would be able to look back and say, "Look at these things I have done, the things I have suffered, and the life that I had. I did the right thing. I took responsibility for my actions, and for the cards that life dealt me. I lived my life to the fullest, including the pain and including the hardship. To support his case, Viktor cites a study of Americans who came back from Vietnamese prisoner of war camps. The Vietnamese were infamously brutal with their tortures, but when the Americans were surveyed about their experiences, many said that it was a growing experience. He also cites a letter he got from a young man named Jerry Long, who broke his neck at 17 years old in a diving accident, paralyzed from the neck down from his injuries. He decided on that day, I broke my neck. My neck did not break me. He takes college classes and he plans on getting a degree and eventually helping people with similar circumstances learn to not give up on life despite its unspeakable hardships. He said, quote, I know that without the suffering, the growth that I've achieved would have been impossible, end quote. Viktor Frankl often asks his patients whether they believed that an ape could understand the reason for the pain it endures when we give it a shot to test a vaccine. Of course, they say no, that an ape would not be able to understand why it suffered. He then asks, is it not possible then that there could be a higher dimension, another world or an afterlife, which hold the answers to the reason for our suffering, despite the fact that we may never know in this life? Of course, this is a very Judeo-Christian way of looking at the world. Our suffering, our pain, our temptations are given to us for reasons which we do not understand. But Frankl says something profound. He says, quote, what is demanded of man is not, as some existential philosophers teach, to endure the meaninglessness of life, but rather to bear his incapacity to grasp its unconditional meaningfulness in rational terms. Logos is deeper than logic, end quote. In other words, it is not man's fate to endure meaningless suffering. It is man's fate to endure suffering without knowing its meaning. And that's a lot different. To not know the reason you suffer or are tempted is a lot different than there not actually being a reason. If you view suffering or even temptation as an opportunity for achievement, not hopelessness, you can transform any situation into a meaningful and important one. Here's a quote that's similar to one I've already read, but it's really good. I have to read it. Quote, live as if you were living for the second time and had acted as wrongly the first time as you are about to act now. In fact, the opportunities to act properly, the potentialities to fulfill a meaning, are affected by the irreversibility of our lives, but also the potentialities alone are so affected. For as soon as we have used an opportunity and have actualized a potential meaning, we have done so once and for all. We have rescued it into the past, wherein it has been safely delivered and deposited. In the past, nothing is irretrievably lost, but rather on the contrary, everything is irrevocably stored and treasured, end quote. In this way, even a life of suffering can be filled with meaning and significance, because everything that happens to you is an opportunity to use your freedom to grow your character. Frankl says that suffering is not necessary for meaning, of course. There is also meaning in accomplishing certain tasks or doing certain things or enjoying or pursuing certain people. This is where Mark the Augustinian is going to object and say that all meaning which isn't grounded in God or which could be destroyed in a concentration camp is going to ultimately be vulnerable. And I'm not sure that Frankl would disagree with that, but he definitely separates his religious answers from his psychological ones. The bulk of Frankl's work is obviously geared towards curing the existential vacuum by finding something meaningful to live for and thus alleviating the symptoms of boredom, depression, aggression, and addiction. In fact, he insists that logotherapy is the school of psychology least likely to insert value judgments from doctor to patient. He says that the moment a doctor gets preachy, it will immediately backfire. Frankl eventually remarried and had children, and he tells the story of his daughter asking him, "Why do you and Mommy call God the good Lord?" And he said, "Well, sweetheart, remember when God took away your measles?" The girl paused for a moment and asked, "But Daddy, it was God who gave me the measles in the first place." Smart girl. Again, that comes back to this perplexing reality, Why does God give 4-year-olds the measles? We talked about that in the last episode of Dostoevsky's book, The Brothers Karamazov. And I think it's fair to say that it is not given to us to know why. But what is given us is the benefits of perseverance. God uses evil, pain, and suffering in order to build us into people of character. Not just people who see the best move on any particular chessboard, but people who are actually competent chess masters. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is because Frankl sees the role of the logotherapist as merely to widen the vision of the patient, to see what in their life they find to be meaningful, and encourage them to pick up the responsibility of living well in order to see their lives flourish, despite the potential hardships which that might bring. Now, you might be listening to Frankl and think, geez, this is extremely depressing and pessimistic. But Frankl doesn't see it that way, and neither do I. I think this is incredibly hopeful. Here's a quote on that. Quote, logotherapy, keeping in mind the essential transitoriness of human experience, is not ultimately pessimistic, but rather activistic. To express this point figuratively, we might say, the pessimist resembles a man who observes with fear and sadness that his wall calendar, from which he daily tears a sheet, grows thinner with each passing day. On the other hand, the person who attacks the problems in life actively is like a man who removes each successive leaf from his calendar and files it neatly and carefully away with its predecessors, after first having jotted down a few diary notes on the back. He can reflect with pride and joy on all the richness set down in those notes, and all the life that he has already lived to the fullest. What will it matter to him if he notices that he is growing old? Has he any reason to envy young people whom he sees, or wax nostalgic over his own lost youth? What reasons has he to envy a young person? For the possibilities that a young person has? The future which is in store for him? No, thank you, he will think. Instead of possibilities, I have realities in my past. Not only the reality of work done and of love loved, but of sufferings bravely suffered. These sufferings are even the things which I am most proud, though these are things which cannot inspire envy." End quote. And that is the picture which Frankl offers. A picture and an opportunity for you to recognize life as an opportunity to exercise your freedom and become the person that you actually want to be, not the person that you are by default. You know, it's interesting. Freud thought that if you exposed even the most diverse people uniformly to hunger, they would increasingly retreat into a beast-like state and become monolithic. Everyone would equally devolve into the expression of one single urge. But Frankl contradicts that. He says that Freud's patients lay on a plushy couch in the Victorian era, and thank God that Freud himself never had to see a concentration camp. But Frankl says that he experienced firsthand that hunger does not reduce people's individual differences. They do not blur into one image. Rather, people's differences become more radical. People become unmasked for who they really are, both swine and saints. When the stress and the pressure comes, it is who you are on the inside that will make or break you. The last paragraph of the original publication of Man's Search for Meaning is worth the price of the book. For too long a time, for half a century in fact, psychiatry tried to interpret the human mind merely as a mechanism, and consequently the therapy of mental disease merely as a terms of technique. I believe that this dream has been dreamt out. What now begins to loom on the horizon are not the sketches of a psychologist's medicine, but rather those of a humanized psychiatry. A doctor, however, who would still interpret his own role mainly as that of a technician, would confess that he sees in his patient nothing more than a machine, instead of something that is truly human, behind the disease. A human being is not one thing among others. Things determine each other, but man is ultimately self-determining. What he becomes, within the limits of endowment and environment, he is made out of himself. In the concentration camps, for example, in this living laboratory and on this testing ground, we watched and witnessed some of our comrades behave like swine, while others behaved like saints. Man has both potentialities within himself. Which one is actualized depends on decisions, but not on conditions. Our generation is realistic, for we have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips." End quote. After reading Man's Search for Meaning the second time in preparation for this series, I was confronted more seriously with the challenge of integrating Frankl's ideas into my own. The first time I had read it, I was just so excited and intrigued. I didn't think about areas where we might actually disagree, or at least think of things differently. I realized that Viktor Frankl had impacted me in ways I didn't fully understand, but also that Tolstoy had impacted me in ways that I didn't fully understand. Tolstoy and Frankl seem to offer mutually exclusive ideas about meaning, at least perhaps. For Frankl, a meaningful life is not abstract. It is concrete, lived as right action, moment to moment. It's not a task or an idea. But for Tolstoy, a meaningful life is seeing God as he really is, and seeing his handiwork in the world. Seeing God not through the lens of the Freemasons or the state or the church or through self-sacrifice or any of that, but just admiring him for himself and his handiwork. I suspect Frankl would think that this is too abstract. I think this podcast presented me with the challenge of defining and articulating my view of the meaning of life, as well as expressing it coherently and articulately. I'm not sure that I've done that yet, and even if I do right now, there's no guarantee that I don't read a book next week that revolutionizes my ideas again. But for now, at least, since I can't imagine discovering something on this topic more profound than the writings of these two men, I think I'm up to the task. After some reflection, I realized that I have integrated Tolstoy, Frankl, and my Augustinian conviction that the most fulfilling life can only be found in the pursuit of God. So I wanted to say, from me to you, from soul to soul, that at least as far as I am consciously aware, I find purpose in life by viewing all of life as a story told by God, a story which I am privileged to participate in. I believe that I, Mark Stanley, and you, whoever you are, have a unique and important role to play in the universe. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. And what I do is, I try to see every single moment of every single day, as Frankl does, as an opportunity to get it right. An opportunity to faithfully fulfill my purpose, my aim, which is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Perhaps that is abstract and idealized, but when I see my life as an opportunity to reflect God's goodness back to Him, words cannot describe the humility and the awe that I feel. And the way that is embodied practically on a minute-to-minute basis is sometimes expressed by eating a meal and enjoying it, and truly being thankful and savoring the beauty of it. Sometimes I do this by writing a script for this podcast and being faithful with my time. Sometimes I do it with my mind as I contemplate a divine doctrine or a passage of Scripture and admire the truth, goodness, and beauty of God. Sometimes I do it with my heart as I interact with my wife or laugh with my brother or play a board game with my friends. Sometimes I do it with my body as I exercise and remember that my body is a gift, and here, right now, I have an opportunity to suffer courageously for a higher end, which is an expression of responsibility and thankfulness for my body. Whether I eat or I drink or whatever I do, I try to do it for the glory of God, and I find all the meaning I can possibly manage in that. So you see how everything can be transformed into a meaningful experience. I think this is what Pierre realized at the end of War and Peace, when we see him smiling to himself as he's listening to the latest drama in Russian high society or whatever. He realizes as he listens to people that he's listening to a person who is designed and maintained by God. And it's beautiful. God takes care of the birds, God takes care of the trees, and God takes care of people, and it's all running smoothly according to His plan, even if it's confusing and painful sometimes. He sees God's handiwork everywhere, and He's in love with it. And I think the embodiment of that sentiment every day, remembering that suffering is an opportunity for growth and temptation is an opportunity for triumph, all sanctioned, authorized, and supervised by God himself for my joy and his glory, both now and forever. I think that that's something that just might get me through tough times. In Paul's letter to a group of Christians in Philippi, recorded in scriptures as Philippians, Paul says, quote, "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake." End quote. Philippians 1:27-29. Do you hear that? It has been granted to you for the sake of Christ that you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Another letter, this time to the Ephesians, sums up the Christian message so perfectly. This is Christianity right here. The whole thing. Quote, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not of your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." End quote. Ephesians 2:1-10. Do you hear that? That is so beautiful. That is so good. That is so incredible. How do you not find meaning in that? For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. That inspires me to want to live out my fate and to do the good works which God has prepared beforehand, and to see and taste his mercy and his love, and witness the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness towards us in the coming ages. And I apologize if you are far more interested in Dr. Frankl than my theology, but it was important for me to assimilate Frankl's ideas into my own. I've talked about at least 3 different ideas about the meaning of life on the podcast, and trying to explain how I integrate them seemed important. After all, Frankl does say that there are at least 3 ways of finding meaning in life: some kind of activity, some kind of person, or finding meaning in suffering. But I think those first 2 are rather weak, to be honest. If you find meaning in something that can be burned in a concentration camp, you're going to be severely depressed and shattered after that. I seriously think that the Augustinian view is supremely true, that the only thing in life that can give you the meaning that you desire, the grounding, the transcendence that you need, is in another world, is something beyond this world that pierces down into it. And I think the shadow of God is so beautiful that it's worth pursuing. Before signing off, I'm going to give you one more powerful quote. Viktor Frankl ends his book so powerfully, I want you to carry this with you. Regardless of how much you agree with me or him at all, this is profound. Quote, "You may be prone to blame me for invoking examples that are exceptions to the rule. You may, of course, ask whether we really need to refer to saints. Wouldn't it suffice just to refer to decent people? It is true that they form a minority. More than that, they will always form a minority. And yet I see therein the very challenge to join the minority. For the world is in a bad state, but everything will become still worse unless each of us does his best. So let us be alert, alert in a twofold sense. Since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of, and since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake. Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast.